Morning, Jillian. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good.
Good to hear. Look sleepy?
Yeah.
So just a programming note here. Tomorrow I'll have the lecture, but it's going to be a recorded one. So what you're going to see is a recording, not live. I have a meeting tomorrow with the administration at Marshall High School
Okay.
to discuss how we're going to do this all online going into the future.
Is it still going to be required?
I have no idea. I don't know how they're going to work it. So
Uh-oh.
some school districts, I think, have some kind of attendance policy, but I don't know how they're going to work it. No idea. So this will all be brand new information. I'll share whatever I got when I get back from that. So
Sounds good.
okay, we're going to continue on talking about psychological development here. And yesterday we had finished up talking about Freud's id and superego. And we're going to, obviously, there's a third part to this personality development, and that is the ego itself. And that's what we're going to spend considerable time today talking about Freud's ego and how it manifests itself, trying to balance the id and the superego, because that is kind of its job. So now what the ego does is pretty related to the id and the superego. Like I said, the id and the superego, as you can imagine, are always kind of fighting. They're the, like I said yesterday, the little angel and the little devil on your shoulders if you watch old cartoons. So they are the proverbial angel and devil on your shoulders. And the id is trying to get you to do things like eat cake and not go jogging. And the superego is basically trying to get you to be a good person. It's trying to get you to be an upstanding citizen. And what the ego does is it basically mandates or mediates between the two. It has to decide, okay, who's right here, the ego or sorry, the superego or the id, and how do I balance those two impulses? So the ego is a mediator between these two parts of your personality. They're always going to be fighting with each other. So now the ego is really the only one of these three that's kind of fully conscious, so you're aware. What you think of as you is what Freud would call your ego. And the ego operates on something that's called the reality principle. If you remember, we talked about yesterday, operating on the pleasure principle. The ego operates on the reality principle. And what the reality principle basically means is that you are taking these unconscious drives. You're taking your id's desire to eat cake and your superego's desire to make you not be a horrible person, and you're interpreting that and making those into real actions. So the ego is the only thing that real behavior comes from. The id, the superego are both unconscious drives that your mind is mediating and then turning into behavior according to Freud. So like I've said before, what the superego would make you do, it would make you apologize to your roommate for eating the cake. And what's really making you write that note is your ego. Your ego is taking the input of guilt. So the ego is basically taking bad action, which is what the id did plus guilt, and it's coming up with a solution. It's coming up with an action is to write a note. So that's basically how the id, the ego, and the superego interact with each other in Freud's theory. Now, I said before that while it's kind of outdated, it's actually really important to the way that we think about ourselves. And the sense in which that's true is that they're really not sections of your brain that are these things. You can't look at your brain and see that when you make impulsive decisions, that part lights up. And when you're mediating, this part lights up. And when you feel guilty, this part lights up. That's not what's going on. You couldn't even see that in an fMRI that that's happening. But what does happen is that we really do think of our internal conflicts and work out our problems. And in terms of the impulsive part, the guilty, the judgmental, I know what's the right and wrong part and the part in the middle that has to deal with that. And one way that we see this, that it's really seeped into our culture, is that a lot of books and movies have basically character trios that do this. And an example from more recent popular culture is the Harry Potter movies. You know, you got Harry, you got Ron, you got Hermione. For the two people out there who haven't read the books or seen the movies, Ron is kind of hot-headed, kind of emotional. He's sort of an id figure, and he doesn't really do that well in school. He doesn't think that much. Hermione, she thinks way too much. She always knows what to do. She's definitely the super ego. And then Harry is basically the mediator between Ron and Hermione, and they literally fight in the books. And Harry plays the mediator role quite often and tries to come up with
I'm going back out later on.
realistic action. That's the reality principle.
I need you to go to Walmart or O'Reilly and get.
And we see this over and over again in narrative, and it's because it's really sort of a productive way of thinking about how we work things out. You can think of a lot of other movies and shows understanding these principles where you can see the characters representing the id, the superego, and then the ego trying to balance them out. So now let's approach the subject of Freudian defense mechanisms. How does the ego go about reconciling these two, especially if there's major conflict, these two or unconscious drives of the superego and the id? And this is basically what Freud thought that you do when you're faced with the stress of having to reconcile these conflicts. He thought that stress and anxiety are basically caused by the three parts of your personality fighting with each other. And he thought that your id has lots of impulses and things it wants to do. It's kind of childish. It doesn't really have self-control. And your superego is all self-control, so it's always limiting what the id wants to do. And your ego is the conscious part of you that has to deal with this conflict. And what Freud thought is when this anxiety gets out of hand, your ego starts to feel like it's under attack. And so it tries to do one of these defense mechanisms to protect itself from having to deal with too much stress. Now, it's important to know that these are actually unconscious things. So these are different than a coping strategy, something that you consciously, come up with to try to do to work out stress. A defense mechanism is something that unconsciously you just do a reaction, so to say, regarding this. So a defense mechanism is something that you're doing without really thinking about it to manage the conflict between your three parts of your personality. So as an example, if your id is telling you that you're attracted to your nerdy best friend, your superego might tell you that World of Warcraft paladins aren't really boyfriend material, and this would cause anxiety. So what you might do to deal with the stress that you're feeling because you're attracted to someone inappropriate is you tell your friends that you're worried that your best friend is attracted to you. Now you can see this is a little weird, right? Because that's not what was going on. You were worried you might be attracted to him, but in defense of your superego here, your id kind of is attracted to him. Your superego, no, that's not right. We can't be attracted to someone who sits in front of a computer and plays video games all day. It must be that they're attracted to you because it couldn't be us. So you're the one who's attracted to him. You have no idea if he's attracted to you, but what you're doing is you're projecting what you feel onto him. And that's one of Freud's defense mechanisms called projection, where you basically take your unacceptable desire and you project it onto somebody else. And that's a way to sort of deal with the stress that's caused by wanting something that society tells you you shouldn't have. There are a bunch of these defense mechanisms. That's not just a couple. And some were originally developed by Freud, like projection, and others were actually added much later to the model, including ones added by a psychologist named George Vaillant. And not only did he add a bunch, but he actually classified them into levels: healthy ones and ones that are prone to being overused, etc. And his 4 levels of defense mechanisms were ones that were pathological or possibly related to a mental illness. And these are the kind of, like it sounds like, if you mostly use these ones, that's bad. You're distancing yourself from reality so much that you probably are going to seem a little bit irrational or even insane to other people around you. He also classified some of these defense mechanisms as immature. These are ones that are prevalent in mainly younger people, adolescents. If you use them too much, you may be unable to cope so effectively with reality, and people who are depressed or have personality disorders tend to use these defense mechanisms as well. Then he had a level of neurotic ones, which are actually pretty common. They're semi-effective in the short term. They might get you to feel a little bit better, but they're really not that effective in the long term. And they also can cause problems if you use them too much. And again, these are pretty common. A lot of adults do use neurotic defense mechanisms. And then there are the mature ones. And these are obviously the good ones. They're healthy, they help you solve problems, and you integrate the conflicting impulses, and everything is great. So to understand this a little bit, we can take a look at a couple defense mechanisms that are in each of these levels to really get a sense of what this level of what the levels mean and what a defense mechanism does. So as an example of the pathological one, you have denial, which is really what it sounds like. It's not a river in Egypt. Something happens to you and you're saying that it doesn't. It just didn't happen. And so if you failed a math test and you're really upset by it, this is maybe creating a conflict with your sense of self as being good at math. If you just told people that you did fine, that you didn't fail, that would be a real refusal to accept reality, and that's denial. If it's pathological because you're totally disconnecting yourself of what actually happened. You're not interacting with reality if you use this defense mechanism, and that can lead to some serious problems later. The next one would be an example of an immature one, and that's actually what we were talking about before with projection with your nerdy friend in World of Warcraft and all that. That's an immature one because you're kind of dealing with it. But again, you're getting away from reality a little bit because you're saying that he has a crush on you, which isn't necessarily the case. You really have no idea. He might, but you don't know. So it's not quite as far from reality as just refusing to acknowledge that the situation exists, like with the math test. But it's still not, you're not quite there and dealing with the reality of the situation. Another one, and this is one of the ones that was added later that isn't an original one of Freud's, but you've probably heard referenced before, is passive aggression. And that's another immature one. You're upset with your roommate. Let's say you made a cake and she ate it. So you might forget to pick her up from work like you promised, but you really didn't forget. You just didn't do it as a way to get her back. And this is bad because you're expressing anger, but you're not doing it in a way that's tied to anything that she can understand. You're not really dealing with the situation. You're just acting out in a passive aggressive way. Another level would be the neurotic ones. And this is actually where a lot of Freud's original defense mechanisms were classed. And a classic one is displacement. If you were playing on a soccer team and your coach benches you, and then you yell at everyone around you, you're really mad at your coach, but you're taking it out on other people, that's displacement. You're displacing the anger you feel onto somebody else. It helps you deal with the anger, but it's not really that productive because you're not getting to the reality or the source of the anger and dealing with it on that level. Another one is repression. And to take it back to your World of Warcraft crush again, if instead you dealt with it by refusing to think about him and avoiding him, that would be repression because you're basically not acknowledging the way that you feel at all, which is not as bad as denying that it exists, but it's still not that healthy. Then we get to the last level, which is the mature ones. And these are the ones that are good. These actually help you usually. One of them is sublimation. And if you're a writer and you wrote a novel, you worked really hard on it and it got rejected by everyone, that would probably be pretty depressing. But if when that happens, you turn your disappointment and your sadness about it into work ethic, you decide to work really hard at fixing the book and making it the best you can, that would be a really healthy way to deal with it. And that's what sublimation is. It's turning negative emotions into real positive actions, making your book better because you were sad about it being neglected. And if we were going to use sublimation on a couple of the other instances we talked about, perhaps your World of Warcraft crush, by doing that, you go, I don't feel comfortable about this. I'm going to talk it over by him, see if there's any possibility, maybe go on a date, but nothing serious, just to work this out, see if this is something that might actually be a possibility. That would be sublimation. In terms of your math test, instead of just ignoring the reality and denying the reality that you failed, maybe just going, okay, I need to study more next time. I was weak in this area. I need to focus on it or something like that. Another one, my favorite one, is humor. You lose your job and then you joke about it with your friends. That's a way of expressing bad feelings, but it's a way that's easier to deal with. And you're not denying it, but you're expressing it in a healthy way. And of course, there's situations where people, oh, this isn't funny, you shouldn't be joking about it, such as jokes about the coronavirus and the quarantine or people passing away. Certainly, those are very bad things, and nobody's denying the gravitas or the seriousness of those things. But sometimes to make a joke about it, to lighten it up, it's actually considered a very healthy way to deal with things. And so humor is considered kind of a mature way of dealing with a lot of grave and serious issues. So don't ever put down people who are trying to make a little bit of light. They might be making bad jokes and then you kind of groan, but they're dealing with it in their own way and in a way that's considered fairly mature by most psychologists. So that's basically an overview of a lot of defense mechanisms and then classified into those levels of basically, are they healthy or not? In descending order from pathological to immature to neurotic to mature. And this is, again, to deal with anxiety that results from, at least how Freud theorized, your id, your ego, and your superego fighting with each other. And that causes stress, and you use these mechanisms, these unconscious ways to deal with that stress in varying effectiveness. So we're going to talk about Freud's stages of psychosexual development. And this is where Freud gets weird for most people. We kind of already talked about Freud's, everything goes back to sex, basically, the sex drive, eros, he called it. And so as we progress through life towards that adult sex drive for reproduction, every stage of your life is basically defined by how you get to that place. And so, even infants are kind of focused on future sexual production in some way. And so, of course, it sounds bizarre and everything. I hope we're adults enough that, we can talk about this without, losing it like little children in regards to this. But some of it is kind of weird and we'll get a chuckle from you. So psychosexual is kind of a big word, but it really means is that Freud thinks that personality develops through stages that have to do with one's sexuality. And basically, this is a way of explaining personality, and it rests on the ideal that you go through phases as an infant through to childhood, and then the final stage is adulthood, in which you're basically fixated on certain body parts. What Freud thought, which is a little funky, is that humans basically have what we call an instinctual libido. Libido is basically a familiar word probably that basically just means sex drive. And that we all have an instinctual sex drive, a biological need to procreate. But the weird thing about Freud's theory, most people probably wouldn't deny that's a basic biological drive, but he basically thought that infants from birth have a sex drive, that we have an instinctual libido. And in the beginning, there's some form of sexual drive that is present, and it's key to developing personality. And he thought that this libido developed in stages, and these are the psychosexual stages. And they develop through you focusing on different body parts, basically, as you grow. So what he thought was that if anxiety or trauma occurred during one of the stages, then what you're going to have when you're an adult later on in life is a characteristic set of problems, neuroses, anxieties that have to do with development being interrupted at that stage at that particular body part. And I think as I describe the stages, you'll get a feel more for what Freud means by that. So yes, it's weird. I hope you're with me. Now we're just going to go through these stages and talk them through, though. And so we'll start with stage one, the oral stage. And you can imagine or picture this because a little baby, they get something in their hands. What's the first thing they do with it? They shove it in their mouth. And so this is kind of what Freud means by the oral stage. And this is from when you're born to when you're about 2 years old. If you think about it, it makes a little sense that oral would be the first one. Babies like to chew on things. They like to suck on things. So it makes a certain amount of sense that Freud would go there. The life is really dominated by breastfeeding initially for babies. And an important part about that stage is that the baby is pretty much entirely id-driven at this point. They have yet to develop a morality sense, a super ego to argue with it. And so the ego doesn't have to ameliorate or mediate between these two. It just goes straight to the id in terms of action. If it feels good, do it, according to a baby. It's not thinking, it's doing things instinctually. It has certain wants and desires that are pretty simplistic, and it goes about and it does them. Now, what Freud thought this had to do with personality is that when babies are weaned or, eventually taken off the breast and given solid foods, when they're not allowed to breastfeed anymore, the baby learns the principle of delayed gratification. And delayed gratification is fairly important in lots of areas of our life. We don't just, wow, that food looks really good, and, certainly eat a lot of stuff. So I'm getting an emergency alert here. Oh, they need licensed healthcare workers to sign up. Unfortunately, I'm not one, so don't have to worry about that. But so Freud thought that a lot of this delayed gratification learning, which is stuff that's good. Again, I think I was saying that before the emergency alert went off, that if you just saw something you thought it looked good and you ate it all, you'd probably weigh 900 pounds. So, having some sense of delayed gratification, that looks good, I'll save it for dessert later or something like that, or I don't have to pass it by this time, I'll come try it again another time. That's what we mean by delayed gratification. And obviously, apart from food, delayed gratification in terms of, love, in terms of money, there's all kinds of things that delayed gratification is necessary for to be successful in life. So this is super important because you can't just go over to the bathroom whenever you want in life. You can't just eat whatever you want. It's a pretty key concept to being a functioning adult and not just doing what you want all the time. Now, what Freud thought was that if the parents were too indulgent in this stage or didn't enforce this well enough, the kid might resist growing up. He wouldn't develop this sense in a proper way, in other words. If parents were basically too delayed with their gratification, the kid would basically grow up being manipulative of others. And that was the way that Freud thought the whole breastfeeding id development in the oral stage went anyway. And thus is when this entered our language. People who are stuck at the oral stage, Freud called having an oral fixation. And the basic theory about the oral stage that Freud has is that if people are interrupted at this stage, if they don't go through the full stage and the weaning process and everything, they'll actually do things like smoke and eat too much. So if you keep breastfeeding them too long, they'll expect to get things they want right now and be manipulative. But if you take them off too soon, well, then they're still stuck in that stage and they want to put things in their mouth a lot. So they'll do things like, chew on pins, smoke, eat too much. And this is something that's actually entered our vocabulary. It's actually the title of Shakira album, Oral Fixation. Stage 2 is the anal stage. And about 15 months to 3 years is considered the general anal stage range. And as one might expect from the title, the key experience here, and remember the key experience from the oral stage was breastfeeding, is toilet training, the ability to control one's bladder and anal muscles until you reach a toilet. So what this does is, as you can imagine, it continues the development of delayed gratification because, like I said, you can't just go running off to the bathroom whenever you want. That's not cool. So in this stage, basically, the ego starts to develop and it starts to rein in the id. I got to go to the bathroom when you're a baby. You just do it. Hopefully you're wearing a diaper, although with 5 kids, I've had plenty of opportunities where they're not wearing a diaper, which is great fun in of itself. But when you have to go and you're in the middle of class or you're in the middle of an important meeting or someone's talking to you, you don't just go, excuse me, I go to the bathroom. Unless it's an obvious real emergency, which is for most of us some kind of health problem or something, like we have diarrhea or something. Most of us can control our bladder and our bowels here. But when we're really young, we don't have that control, but we're taught that control. We're taught that it's wrong to just pee our pants, poop our pants, basically. That we're told that, okay, we have to do these things and then go on to the bathroom when we have a chance. So the id starts to be reined in by the superego saying, no, just wait, you can hold it. So the ego's always dealing with having you interact with reality. And so the ego starts to rein the id in a little bit, not as much as the superego will later, but it works on it a little bit. And what's basically going on during toilet training is that parents are trying to teach the kid to be clean, but they need to do this in a way that the ego can grow up properly. So if they're way too demanding about cleanliness, like, I had my brother-in-law, when he taught his kids toilet training, man, he was like, 3 wipes and, you fold the square. I mean, he was like really into it and exactly what they needed to do. So if they're not understanding that toilet training is hard, I can't quite remember that. I'm sure it was. If they're not understanding of that, the kid is going to grow up really obsessed with order, to the point I can remember my brother-in-law's daughter, who's not my sister-in-law's daughter. It's a convoluted thing. But anyway, she would freak out if a leaf blew on her shoe. When she was like 3, I remember her having a meltdown because she walked out in the fall with her nice clean tennis shoes and a leaf blew on her shoe and she had a meltdown. So she was really obsessed with cleanliness and order. And this is what Freud thought anyway. These are people that we describe, and this is another one of those things that's gotten into our language as anal compulsive. And that's what we mean by that. They're, oh my God, everything's got to be in the right place at the right time, in the right order. So if you've ever described someone as anal because they have their action figures all in a row and they're color coordinated, that's what you're basically saying, is that they are too obsessed with order. And what Freud would think is that their parents don't toilet train them properly. They were too demanding of them. But if the parents aren't demanding enough, predictably, the kid is going to grow up to be a total mess. As you can imagine, anybody who thinks it's okay to just, wet their pants right there because they had to go is, a little bit challenged. And this is one that hasn't really gotten into our language so much, and you can probably guess by the actual term why it hasn't gotten our language, because it's kind of gross to think about. But Freud referred to this as anal expulsive, and that always projects an image in my mind of someone with bad diarrhea, basically. So you don't really go around calling people that, but what it basically means is you've probably had a roommate like this that is just a mess. They leave their stuff everywhere, and Freud thought that kind of personality type was related to parents who weren't demanding enough of their kids during toilet training. So that's all I had for you guys today. Do you guys have any questions regarding any of this? Just go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself if you do, or if you want to share anything.
Nope.
Kevin?
Nope.
Kevin, I was sorry about your great-grandmother yesterday, so my condolences on that.
It's okay. I thought I'd have time to sit in for the rest of it, but we had to go run some errands before the funeral. So.
Yeah, and I think I did run a little bit over yesterday too, so I apologize for that. All right, guys. Well, like I said, tomorrow will be recorded. My plan is, depending on how things are going to go at this meeting tomorrow and what we're going to do, is to continue doing this. However, I will take next week off as the spring break there. The fact of the matter is we're well far ahead of the schedule. The presentation I just did with you, if we were in class, would be one that I would have done after spring break. So we're pretty far ahead, so I feel comfortable in this class taking that break next week from this. So take some time off and enjoy. Hopefully the weather will get a little bit nicer and we can all get outside some and maybe relieve some of the stress from being cooped up from all this. So if you guys don't have any questions, that's where I'll end today. And I'll see you guys, like I said, a recorded one tomorrow. So same time, same place. You're just going to be watching a recording. And then hopefully we'll talk live again on Thursday.
Okay.
All right, guys, have a good day.
See you.
Bye-bye.